There was an article that I sent you. One of them was from, I think I got it off of dig.com, but it was Jordan Peterson is having his moment and we should ignore him. And I sent this to you, and there was one part
probably the last part of that might be true. But
one of the things in the article was citing this study that showed very little difference between
I read
men
that
and
damn
women.
study.
Yeah.
Oh God, it's a pathetic study.
Yeah,
Well,
I sent it to you because I was like, this is not right.
Well, the thing is, like most things, it's complicated.
Yes.
So are men and women more similar or more different? Well, it depends on how you define the terms first. But they're more similar. Well, why? Well, they're the same species. So we could start with that. But the question is, what are the differences and how do they manifest themselves, and are those manifestations important? So here's an example. If you took a random woman out of the population and a random man, and you had to bet on who was more temperamentally aggressive. If you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. But you'd be wrong 40% of the time. And that's not a walloping difference, right? 60-40. It's not 90-10. So there's a lot of overlap between men and women in terms of their levels of aggression. And you think, well, they're more the same. Yeah, except. So then let's say, no, let's play a slightly different game. Let's pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person from the random population. Well, they're all men. And that's why all the people in prison are men. So even though on average, men and women, well, yeah, right. It's 90 to 95%, right? So, and often if the women are in prison, it's because they got tangled up with a really bad guy, So one of the problems is that differences at the extreme are where the differences really start to manifest themselves. And so you can have a small difference at the level of the average, but out at the extremes, it starts to make a massive difference. So let's say to be a Google engineer, which is hard, right? Because you not only have to be an engineer, but you have to be a very good engineer. Say, well, you have to be interested in things rather than people. That's a huge difference in interest. Like men are more interested in things, generally speaking, and women are more interested in people, generally speaking. Now, there's still a lot of overlap between them, but that's one of the biggest differences between men and women. It's been demonstrated cross-culturally. It's also a very big difference in the Scandinavian countries. Well, on average, the difference isn't that great, even though it's a relatively large difference. But at the extremes, it's the same thing. Almost all the people who are hyper-focused on things, they're almost all men. And all the people who are hyper-focused on people are almost all women. And so how does that play out in the world? Well, in the Scandinavian countries, it plays out this way. About 85% of nurses in Scandinavia are female, and about 85 to 90% of engineers are male. It doesn't mean women can't be engineers. It doesn't mean men can't be nurses. It also doesn't have anything to do with intelligence, but it does have to do with interest, and the differences in interest are big. Now, at the extremes in particular. So when you read a review like that, the one that was pointed out, the first question is, well, what do you mean by big and little? There's more overlap. There's more overlap between men and women than there is difference on virtually every parameter. Okay, fine. Are the remaining differences significant in how they play out in the world? And the answer to that is overwhelmingly significant, because you select for extremes. So here's another example. Ashkenazi Jews have an average IQ of 115. So in the typical population overall has an average IQ of 100. 15 points is about the difference between the typical college student and the typical high school student. Okay, so it's not a massive difference, but if you go to the extremes, say, well, let's go look at people who only have an IQ of 145, which is kind of where you hit the beginnings of genius level. It's like the Jews are overwhelmingly overrepresented. So relatively small differences in the average can produce walloping differences at the extremes. And people don't understand that. It's not surprising, because it actually requires a fairly sophisticated grasp of statistics. But when we're talking about things like differential outcome in the workplace, then you have to take a sophisticated statistical approach to it, or you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And unfortunately, many of the people who are talking about things like gender differences, they have no idea what they're talking about. They don't know the literature. They don't know there is a literature. They don't understand biology, like the social constructionist types, the women's studies types, the neo-Marxists. They don't give a damn about biology. It's like they inhabit some disembodied universe. So the review was poorly written at best and did not showed a very poor grasp of the relationship between group differences and economic and practical outcomes. Well, there are differences between men and women, personality-wise, apart from the biological ones. Are those caused by cultural differences? Hey, turns out we can answer that. How? Rank order countries by how egalitarian their social policies are. Does everyone agree? Yeah. The Scandinavians are at the top. Everyone agrees. Left, right, doesn't matter. Everyone agrees. It's like, okay, so you stack up the cultures by how egalitarian their social policies are. And then you look to see how big the differences are between men and women up that hierarchy of egalitarianism. And if as the societies become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women disappear, then it's sociocultural. That isn't what happened. What happened is that as the societies got more egalitarian, the differences between men and women got bigger, not smaller. It means the sociocultural construct people, and I'm talking to you sociocultural construct people, you're wrong. You're wrong. You make the societies more egalitarian, men and women get more different.
Who makes the argument in opposition to this?
All of the social constructionists, all the radical left-wingers.
And what do they use as fact?
They don't have facts, but then they criticize the whole idea of facts. Then they go after the whole idea of science as a Western patriarchal construct.
What's their motivation?
The motivation is that if people are different, then equality of outcome isn't neither desirable nor achievable.
And why do they want equality of outcome? Why is this so
That's a good question.
attractive to
Well,
them?
part of it is actual compassion. Look, man, it's not good that people lose, and it's certainly not good that some losers lose all the time. Who wants that? You happy when you walk down the street and see homeless people? It's like, hey, look, the hierarchy's working. Look at these homeless people. No one's happy about that.
Right.
Right, okay, so the fact of failure within a hierarchy of value is painful. And so to give the devil his due, you give the left its due, just like you do the right, is like, yeah, it's painful that hierarchies produce dispossession. Bloody right. Okay, what's the cure? Get rid of the hierarchy. Hey, well, wait a minute, man. You get rid of the hierarchy, you get rid of the value structure, you get rid of the tools that allow us to generate absolute wealth and stop people from starving. It's a catastrophe. Okay, so there's the problem, you have to have the hierarchy. But then also, it isn't just compassion on the left. It's envy. It's like, okay, if I'm standing for the dispossessed, what makes me so sure that I'm not just standing against the successful? And maybe that's because I'm bitter and jealous and envious and resentful. And certainly it's highly probable. If you look at what happened in the leftist societies that tried to pursue utopia, and you don't read envy and resentment into that, you don't know the history, because that's clearly the case. Why else did they become murderous? Well, this is the question. It's like, it's clearly the case that the Soviet Union, for example, was motivated by the desire for equality of outcome as a primary motivation. What happened? 25 million people were killed. Why? Why? Well, was it all compassion and love for the dispossessed? Or was it absolutely bitter resentment and hatred for anyone who had any shred of success whatsoever on any possible dimension of evaluation? People have problems. Everybody can agree on that. And then we could assume that people would like solutions to those problems. So we could agree on that. Then we could say, well, then if you implement a solution socially, so with other people, then you're going to cooperate and compete in relationship to the solution. And that's instantly going to produce a hierarchy. Because no matter what the problem is, some people are going to be better at solving it than others. And then if you have any sense, you put the people who are good at solving it at the forefront, because then they solve it faster and cheaper and better. And then everybody benefits. But then you get a hierarchy.
Right. The people who solve those problems get financial incentive to solve those problems.
Yes, and they do that. And they do that because the rest of us are greedy and desperate. It's like, we want the people who are good at solving the problems to keep solving them. And so what we're trying to do is to reward them so that they'll keep doing it even if it's difficult.
Yes.
To
and
give them some status.
Them extraordinarily.
If necessary.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, when you look at the people that are the head of giant industry, the CEOs of super successful companies, they're the ones who have the giant yachts and the big houses. And this is the incentive for people to try to get to that position. And the idea that there's no incentive and that there should be no incentive, but yet you're still going to have all this innovation is ridiculous. It's not how it works. It's not how human beings work. If human beings are going to to work really hard, there has to be some sort of a reward, and it can't be an equal reward.
Yes, and then what you could say, like, so the right, that would be, roughly speaking, a conservative position. And then you can take a left-wing position that's reasonable, and you can say, yes, there are hierarchies, but we have to stay awake because they can degenerate into power-hungry tyrannies.
Yes.
So that it's no longer competence. It's political machination and game playing and
Yes.
tyranny that produce the positional differentiation.
Right.
So we got to stay awake to that. And so we got to criticize the hierarchies, not the fact of hierarchy, but the structure of hierarchy, so they stay honest. And then we also have to be careful, because when you do set up a hierarchy, then a lot of people collect at the bottom. That's the necessary consequence of a few people collecting at the top. And so then you have to be concerned about those people at the bottom. And so there's a variety of things that you would do to express that concern. Is one, you might want to have a lot of hierarchies so that people of different talents could play different games. And a complex society is pretty good at that. But you're still going to have people who stack up at the bottom of all hierarchies, right? And those are going to be people who are sick, mentally and physically, and maybe people who are cognitively impaired, or who've experienced some kind of catastrophe in their life. And then you want to set up your system so that those people don't suffer unduly, partly because that's bad and partly because that destabilizes your whole society. And so you could say, well, that's the left's place, is to speak on behalf of the unjustly dispossessed. And the right's position is to stabilize and maintain functional hierarchies.
And encourage competition.
And encourage competition that's of benefit to the whole.
Yes.
And to the individuals within the competition. And then the political dialogue is a continual discussion between the left and the right, saying, well,
Right.
this hierarchy's getting a little too steep and a little too rigid, and that's, for me, that's also the fundamental reason for the necessity of free speech. It's because
that's the only way to discuss this.
it's the only way of working it out.
Yeah.
And it is the case. You're going to produce hierarchies. If you're going to pursue things of value socially, you're going to produce hierarchies. The victim-victimizer narrative only works if you assume that you're a victim.
Right.
And as soon as you assume that you're a victimizer, well, then it's not so much fun. And one of the
Right.
things, I wrote the foreword for the new version of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the abridged version. It came out November 1st. And I was trying to figure out why the Russian Revolution went wrong so rapidly, because it went wrong right from the beginning. And Solzhenitsyn quotes this guy named, I think his name was Walter Latsis, if I remember correctly. I got the Latsis part right anyways. And he said, when you're interrogating a member of the bourgeoisie to decide whether they constitute an enemy of the state, you don't give any credibility to such niceties as individual guilt or innocence. All you care about is their group and their background and their economic status. And if they're in the wrong group, the bourgeoisie, then that's it. That's the end of them. And Solzhenitsyn comments, not just the end of them, but the end of their children and their grandchildren as well. And Latsis was eventually executed by Stalin. Somebody wrote me and just told me that after I wrote the foreword. But one of the things I figured out was this, and this is really worth thinking about, man. So the intersectional claim is that each person has more than one group identity. So fundamentally, if you're going to calculate their victim status, then you have to calculate it across all the different groups that they might be victims in. And so, maybe, who knows, a Native American is one form of victim in this line of thinking, but a Native American victim is female is like twice the victim, or however you would calculate that mathematically. It's like, okay, and maybe you can be put into 6 different groups. We already talked about that a little bit. But here's the bloody rub. If I put you in 6 groups, in one of those groups you're a victimizer. You can bloody well bet on it. And then here's the next rule. If you're a victimizer among any possible dimension of analysis, then it's the gulag for you. And so that's the fundamental danger of that group identity, victimizer-victim narrative, is that you fragment your identity in multiple dimensions. You'll find out that you're a victimizer. And then everyone's a criminal. And then everyone's guilty. That's exactly what happened in Russia. And then you think, well, wait a minute. There were a bunch of people who were really compassionate about the poor. It's like, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, that 20% of the communists were really concerned about the poor. Maybe we could say 50%. Just to be arbitrary about it. The other 50% were jealous and resentful about anyone who had anything more than they did. All right, now that you put those two groups head to head in a battle for 4 years and see who's standing at the end. Even if you are one of those utopians who actually cares for the dispossessed, when the revolution comes, you can bloody well be sure that your head's going to be first on the chopping block, because the people who are motivated by hate are going to be a lot more vicious in their attempts to eradicate than you're going to be, what would you call it, effective in your attempts to save. That whole game, that whole identity politics game, that is dangerous beyond belief. And it's predicated fundamentally on resentment and the desire to devolve people back into a tribal antagonism.